The weight of the ledger in my hands was a familiar comfort, 27 pounds of pressed paper and ruled lines. I knew its weight just as I knew the faint, metallic scent of the ink and the precise scratch of my nib against the page. For the year since Daniel's death, this predictable world of numbers had been my only sanctuary. Each balanced column was a small victory against the chaos that had claimed my life. Rook, my shepherd, lay at my feet beneath the tall desk, his quiet breathing a steady rhythm in the dusty air of the mercantile. Eleanor. Mr. Davies did not look at me. He was polishing the brass handle of the front door, a task he reserved for moments of profound discomfort. I finished my entry, blotted the ink, and closed the ledger. Its finality felt heavy today. "My nephew, William, has returned from the East," he said, his voice aimed at the gleaming brass. "He has a mind for figures. A family mind." I understood before he finished. A family mind. I was not family. I was a convenience, a competent widow hired to keep the books when his wife's cousin fell ill. Now, a more permanent, more suitable replacement had arrived. I had seen the boy yesterday, soft hands and an expensive suit, looking around the store as if measuring it for a new frame. "I see," I said. The words were ash in my mouth. I began to gather my things, my pens, the small bottle of ink, the spare blotter. My movements were small and precise, the same way I moved through my life. I had built my world on the foundation of my own competence because there had been nothing else to build it on. Orphaned young, widowed younger, my ability to perform a task without error was the only currency I possessed. "I'll have your final wages ready by the end of the day," he said, finally turning from the door. His eyes were kind but weak. He could not afford to keep me on, not with family needing a place. I knew the cold arithmetic of it. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. You've been a fine bookkeeper." "Thank you, Mr. Davies." I did not ask for a reference. To ask would be to show the sharp edge of my panic, and I would not give him that. I would not give this town that. I clipped the leash to Rook's collar, and he rose, sensing the shift in the room, the tremor in my hand. He pressed his side against my leg, a solid, living wall. I walked out of the mercantile into the white glare of the afternoon. The dust of the street swirled around my worn boots. I had $2.17 in my purse. My rent was due in 3 days. The world I had so carefully constructed, column by balanced column, had just been erased. It was practical. I had never imagined needing anything more than a place to sleep between shifts. I had been wrong. My room was small, a space carved out of the back of the boarding house, with a window that looked onto a brick wall. It was a place of utility, not comfort. I had never allowed myself the luxury of comfort after Daniel. Grief was a debt that demanded to be paid in full, and I was still making payments. Rook settled on the thin rug by the door, his head on his paws, his dark eyes watching me. He was the only living thing that was truly mine. I emptied my purse onto the bed. $2 silver, a dime, a nickel, 2 pennies. I had a half-full sack of flour, some dried beans, coffee. Enough for a week, perhaps, if I was careful. My mind, trained for this kind of brutal accounting, began to calculate. 7 days. After that, nothing. The panic I had held at bay in the mercantile began to rise, a cold tide in my chest. I had been forgotten by Mr. Davies. I had been forgotten by the world. It was a familiar feeling, the named grief of my life, to be the one left behind. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, my hands clasped in my lap. I watched the dust motes dance in the single shaft of light from the window. What did a woman alone do? I could offer my services as a seamstress, but there were already 3 in town. I could try for work as a laundress, but my hands were accustomed to pens, not lye soap. Every path I saw before me was a dead end. My self-reliance felt like a brittle thing, a thin sheet of ice over deep, cold water. There was a sharp rap on my door. Mrs. Gable, the landlady, never knocked so forcefully. I opened it to find a boy from the telegraph office, holding out a dusty envelope. "For you, Mrs. Eleanor Reed." I took it, my fingers numb. It was not a telegram. It was a letter, thick and formal, the paper of a quality I had not touched in years. The postmark was from a place I had never heard of, Havens Creek. I gave the boy one of my precious pennies and closed the door. My heart hammered against my ribs. Bad news always traveled fast, but this felt different. This felt like something from another world. Rook nudged my hand with his nose, whining softly. I sat back on the bed, my dog's head in my lap, and carefully broke the wax seal. The letter was from a lawyer, a Mr. Alistair Finch. It was written in a cramped, spidery hand. It said that a woman named Agnes Blackwood had passed away. It said that she had been my mother's aunt, my great-aunt. And it said that she had named me, Eleanor Reed, née Thorne, as the sole beneficiary of her estate. The estate consisted of a cabin and 40 acres of land. The letter was dated 2 weeks prior. He had been trying to locate me. I read the sentences again and again, the words blurring. A great-aunt. My mother, who died when I was 6, had never spoken of her family. I had assumed there was no one, that we were adrift together, and then I was adrift alone. But there had been someone. Agnes Blackwood. A name like a stone, solid and old. An inheritance. Not of money, but of land. A place. A fragile, impossible hope began to push back against the panic. A place to belong. It was a dangerous thought, the most dangerous I had allowed myself in a very long time. The journey was 4 days by stagecoach, a bone-jarring, dust-choked ordeal that felt like a deliberate scouring of my old life. With each mile, the flat, sun-baked plains of my previous existence gave way to rolling hills thick with pine and oak. The air grew cooler, cleaner, smelling of damp earth and resin. I had sold nearly everything I owned to afford the passage for myself and for Rook, who lay stoically on the floor at my feet, his body braced against the lurch and sway of the coach. The wooden crate containing my few remaining possessions, Daniel's photograph, my mother's locket, my pens, and a fresh ledger, was strapped to the roof. I spent the hours staring out the window, watching the world transform. The landscape was a canvas for my memories. A lone hawk circling in the vast blue sky brought back Daniel, his easy smile and the way he'd pointed out constellations on clear nights, promising to show me the ocean one day. We had so many plans, all of them written in sand, washed away by a fever that took him in less than a week. The grief was a physical presence, a passenger sitting beside me, its cold shoulder pressed against mine. Then there were the older, more fragmented memories. A flash of my mother's hands, flour-dusted and gentle, kneading dough. The sound of her humming a song with no words I could recall. She was a ghost in my mind, a watercolor portrait blurred by time and sorrow. I had been told she had no family, that she had arrived in town alone, a mystery no one had bothered to solve. This letter, this inheritance, was a contradiction to the entire story of my life. Agnes Blackwood. The name felt foreign, yet it was a thread, however thin, connecting me to a past I never knew I had. Was it possible my mother had not been forgotten, that she had simply been lost? And if she was remembered by someone, was it possible I might be, too? We were the only passengers to get off at the stop for Havens Creek. It wasn't a town so much as a crossroads with a supply post, a blacksmith, and a handful of small, weathered houses nestled in a river valley. The air was different here. The constant, low rumble I had been hearing for the last hour of the journey was the source, a powerful waterfall, hidden by the trees but felt in the very ground beneath my feet. The lawyer's office was a small room attached to the supply post. Mr. Finch was a man who seemed to be made of dust and paper, his skin thin and translucent, his eyes clouded with age. He peered at me over his spectacles as I introduced myself. "Ah, Mrs. Reed. You came," he said, as if there had been some doubt. "Agnes was particular. She said you would." He shuffled through a stack of papers on his cluttered desk and produced a deed, a hand-drawn map, and a single, heavy iron key. "It's all in order. 40 acres, the cabin, and everything in it. It's yours." She was very clear on that point. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I never knew her." She knew of you, he replied, his gaze distant. Agnes kept track. She was a great believer in blood, and in what is owed. He slid a small, locked wooden crate across the desk. It was bound in iron strips. She left this for you as well. Said it would explain more than she ever could. I took the key, its cold weight a shock in my palm. This was real. A piece of land. A home. The thought was so immense, so terrifyingly hopeful, I felt dizzy. As I turned to leave, a woman entered the office. She was older than Mr. Finch, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes as sharp and clear as river stones. She carried a basket of eggs. This is her, then, the woman said, her voice direct, without preamble. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on my worn dress, my tired face, and the steady presence of Rook at my side. Agnes's girl. This is Martha, Mr. Finch supplied. She runs the post. She was Agnes's closest friend. Martha set her basket on the counter and looked at me again. There was no pity in her eyes, only a fierce, appraising scrutiny. You have your mother's eyes, she said. It was not a compliment, it was a statement of fact. Agnes worried you wouldn't be strong enough. The land requires strength. I'm all that's left, I said, the word stark and true. A flicker of something, not softness, but perhaps understanding, passed over her face. Well, she said, turning away to arrange her eggs. We'll see, won't we? The path to the cabin was not a road but a narrow track that wound upwards through dense forest. I followed the map Mr. Finch had given me, Rook trotting ahead, his nose to the ground, as if he already knew the way. The sound of the waterfall grew louder with every step, a deep, resonant roar that vibrated through the soles of my boots. And then I saw it. The cabin was small, built of dark, weathered logs, with a stone chimney and a porch that overlooked the valley. It was nestled in a clearing just to the side of the falls, which cascaded down a sheer rock face into a churning, mist-filled pool below. The power of it was breathtaking. It was a wild, untamed place, beautiful and deeply intimidating. I used the iron key. The lock turned with a grating shriek, and the door swung inward, opening into a single, large room. It was simple, furnished with a sturdy wooden table, a few chairs, a bed built into the wall, and a large stone hearth. But it was clean, impeccably so, as if its owner had just stepped out. A fine layer of dust coated everything, but it was the dust of disuse, not neglect. An oil lamp sat on the table, its glass chimney gleaming. A stack of books rested on a shelf by the hearth. This was a place where someone had lived a life of deliberate solitude. I set my crate on the table and walked to the single window, which looked directly out at the waterfall. The roar was constant, a voice that would never be silent. It was overwhelming. For a moment, the sheer isolation of the place, the raw power of the nature surrounding me, was terrifying. I was a woman of ledgers and straight lines, of quiet rooms and predictable days. This world was one of chaos and might. What was I doing here? Rook came and sat beside me, leaning his weight against my legs. I placed my hand on his head, his fur thick and warm beneath my palm. This was my inheritance. A cabin, a key, and a waterfall that sounded like the end of the world. Fear and hope waged a silent war within me. I had a place. Now I had to find out if I had the strength to keep it. The first week was a blur of labor. I scrubbed the cabin from floor to ceiling, aired out the musty linens, and learned the geography of my small domain. The land was rugged, more rock than soil in most places, but the trees were old and tall. I found a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the cabin and set about clearing the weeds, my hands, so accustomed to the smoothness of paper, quickly becoming calloused and sore. Rook was my constant shadow, exploring every inch of the 40 acres with a joyful intensity, his presence a comfort in the profound quiet, a silence broken only by the ceaseless roar of the falls. Each evening, I sat at the sturdy table with the locked wooden crate before me. It felt like a final testament, and I was not yet ready to read it. I needed to feel the ground beneath my feet first, to earn the right to know the secrets it held. I made trips to Martha's supply post, trading the last of my money for flour, salt, and coffee. She watched me with those sharp, knowing eyes, offering practical advice without a hint of sentimentality. "The winters are hard here," she'd said on my second visit. "The snow can trap you for weeks." Agnes always laid in her supplies by October. It was August. The warning was clear. Finally, on the 8th night, with a storm gathering over the mountains, I decided it was time. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, and rain began to lash against the windowpane. I lit the oil lamp, its golden glow pushing back the shadows. The crate was simple but strong. It took me nearly an hour with a pry bar from the small woodshed to work one of the iron bands loose. The wood groaned in protest, and then, with a final crack, the lid came free. Inside, nestled in dried lavender, was a single, leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn smooth with use. There were no other objects, no money, no jewels. Just this book. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was the explanation Mr. Finch had spoken of. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise, like my own. The first entry was dated 40 years ago. "I have come here to be the guardian," it began. "This land is not mine to own, but mine to protect. The water is the reason. It must be kept pure." I read for hours, the storm outside a distant echo to the storm of revelation building within me. Agnes Blackwood emerged from the pages, not as a stranger, but as a kindred spirit. She was a woman of science and observation, a botanist by training who had come to this remote valley seeking refuge and purpose. She documented the unique flora that grew only in the waterfall's mist, the clarity of the water, the rhythm of the seasons. But as the years passed, the entries grew darker. She began to write about the Prescott family, who owned the vast tracts of land upstream. She mentioned their first attempts to buy her out, polite at first, then insistent. She wrote of their patriarch, a man of immense wealth and ambition, and his refusal to take no for an answer. "He sees only timber and rock," she wrote. "He does not see the life that depends on this water. He does not care." The journal detailed a 40-year war of attrition. Fences cut. Surveyors appearing on her land unannounced. Subtle threats delivered by their hired men. Through it all, Agnes held firm. She was protecting something more than just her home. She wrote of taking water samples, of sending them to a chemist in Denver, of records she kept hidden. "They must not have it," she wrote, the words underlined twice. The cost would be too great. The entries solved the first mystery Mr. Finch had unknowingly posed: what is this land? It was not just 40 acres of wilderness. It was a bulwark. A shield. The water from its falls was a source of life for the entire valley below, and for reasons I didn't yet understand, the Prescott family represented a dire threat to it. And in her words, I began to understand the second mystery: who was Agnes? She was a protector. A woman who had forsaken a world she no longer trusted to stand guard over something she believed in. Her loneliness was a palpable thing in the pages, but it was outweighed by her fierce, unyielding purpose. She wrote of my mother, Sarah, her beloved niece. She wrote of receiving news of my mother's marriage, then of my birth. "A girl," she wrote. "Eleanor. May she be stronger than her mother. May she never have to run." I found the last entry, dated just a month before her death. Her handwriting was shaky, but the words were firm. "I am tired. But I have made arrangements. If the girl is anything like her mother, she will know what to do. The truth is in the roots of this place." I closed the journal, the leather cool beneath my trembling fingers. I was no longer just a destitute widow who had stumbled into a strange inheritance. I was the next guardian. Agnes hadn't just left me her land, she had left me her war. The arrival of Thomas Prescott was as smooth and polished as a river stone. He rode up to my cabin one morning on a fine, dark horse, dressed not in the practical denim of the local men, but in tailored riding clothes. He was handsome, with an easy smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Rook stood beside me on the porch, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Mrs. Reed, he said, tipping his hat. Thomas Prescott. My family's land borders yours to the north. I wanted to welcome you to the valley and offer my deepest condolences on the passing of your great-aunt. His voice was like honey, but I heard the echo of Agnes's journal entries. Prescott. This was the enemy. I kept my face impassive. Thank you, Mr. Prescott. Agnes was a unique woman, he continued, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, the waterfall, the trees, as if taking inventory. Very protective of her privacy. I hope you won't think me forward, but my family has long been interested in this particular parcel. For sentimental reasons, you understand. We would be prepared to make you a very generous offer. Enough to ensure you could live comfortably in any city you choose. He was offering me an escape. A return to a world I understood, but with the security I'd never had. It was a powerful temptation. All I had to do was walk away from a fight I had only just learned was mine. I am not planning on leaving, I said. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. Please, think it over. It is a hard life for a woman alone out here. He tipped his hat again and rode away, leaving a trail of polite menace in the air. His words were echoed, more subtly, by Samuel. He was a trapper I had met at Martha's Post, a man with a quiet demeanor and kind eyes who had taken to stopping by the cabin once or twice a week with a string of fish or news from town. He spoke of Agnes with a sad reverence that I found comforting. He showed me how to spot the best berry patches and which mushrooms were safe to eat. Rook, who was wary of most strangers, seemed to trust him. I, in my profound loneliness, had begun to as well. Prescott was by, I told him a few days after the visit. Samuel nodded, whittling a piece of wood. He's a persistent one. His father and grandfather were the same. They've wanted this land for as long as anyone can remember. Why? I asked, testing him. Progress, I suppose, he said with a shrug. They talk of building a grand hotel by the falls. Bringing in tourists. Changing things. He looked at me, his expression full of gentle concern. It's a heavy burden Agnes left you, Eleanor. No one would blame you if you took Prescott's money and found an easier life. His warmth felt genuine. He was the first person since Daniel who had shown me simple kindness without expectation. Yet his words mirrored Prescott's too closely. It was a small, discordant note, but my mind, trained to find irregularities in columns of figures, snagged on it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I relit the lamp and opened Agnes's journal again, searching for something I couldn't name. I scanned the final year of entries, her descriptions of failing health, of her growing isolation. And then I found it. An entry from 6 months before her death. A young man has been visiting. A trapper. Calls himself Samuel. He is kind, brings me game and news, asks after my health. He is good company, but I see the shadow in his eyes. He has their eyes. The Prescott eyes. He asks too many questions about the land, about the water. He thinks me a lonely old woman. He is not wrong. But I am not a foolish one. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Samuel. He hadn't been a friend. He had been a spy. Sent by Prescott to gauge her weaknesses, and now, mine. Every kindness, every shared confidence, had been a lie, a carefully constructed performance designed to earn my trust and persuade me to sell. The warmth I had felt from him curdled into a cold, bitter poison. I had been a fool, so starved for human connection that I had willingly swallowed the bait. My trust, a fragile and carefully guarded thing, collapsed into dust. I was truly alone, and the enemy was not just at my gate. I had invited him into my home. The storm broke the next day, a furious, wind-driven downpour that turned the waterfall into a thundering monster. The sky was the color of a bruise. It was fitting weather for the mood that had taken hold of me. The betrayal had scraped me raw, but beneath the pain, something else was hardening, a cold, clear resolve. Agnes had not been a fool, and neither was I. Samuel arrived in the late afternoon, shaking the rain from his coat on the porch. Thought you might need some extra firewood, he said, his smile as easy as ever. I stood in the doorway, blocking his entrance. Rook was at my side, hackles raised, a low growl a counterpoint to the thunder. She knew about you, I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the emotion churning inside me. His smile faltered. I don't know what you mean. Agnes. She wrote about you in her journal. The kind young trapper with the Prescott eyes. The mask fell. The warmth in his expression vanished, replaced by a cold, weary impatience. She was a stubborn old woman. Just like you. What do the Prescotts want with this water, Samuel? It's not about the water, he sneered. It's about the land. It's always been about the land. Thomas's grandfather wanted it, his father wanted it, and now he wants it. They always get what they want. You should have taken the money, Eleanor. It would have been easier for everyone. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the grey curtain of rain. The threat was no longer veiled. His words echoed in my head. It's not about the water. But Agnes had been certain it was. The truth is in the roots of this place, she had written. The roots. I looked at the great stone hearth that dominated the cabin. It was the foundation, the root of the home. Agnes had built her life around it. Driven by a frantic energy, I began to search. I ran my hands over every stone of the hearth, pushing and pulling, looking for anything loose. The fire roared, casting dancing shadows that made the small cabin feel vast and threatening. Thunder rattled the window pines. Rook paced nervously, whining at the door. My fingers were raw, my knees aching from kneeling on the hard floor, but I didn't stop. And then I felt it. A large, flat stone at the base, near the back, shifted slightly under my weight. My heart leaped. I dug my fingers into the crack, my nails scraping against the rough mortar, and pulled. It was heavy, but it moved. With a final, desperate heave, I dislodged it, revealing a dark, square opening. A wave of cool, earthy air washed over my face. It was a cellar, a hidden room carved out of the earth beneath the cabin. I grabbed the oil lamp, my hand shaking so badly the flame guttered. Taking a deep breath, I lowered myself into the darkness. The space was small, no bigger than a closet, with earthen walls and a single wooden shelf. It was not empty. On the shelf sat two more ledgers, identical to the one I had used at the mercantile, and a small, tin box. My hands trembled as I opened the first ledger. The pages were filled with columns of numbers, dates, and notations. It was a record of water toxicity levels. Downstream. For 40 years. Then I saw the tin box. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cotton, was another journal. The cover was faded blue cloth. The handwriting inside was delicate, familiar from the few letters I had from my childhood. It was my mother's. Agnes hadn't just been guarding the land. She had been guarding my mother's last words. The final, terrible piece of the puzzle fell into place. This was not just Agnes's war. It had been my mother's, too. The lamplight flickered, casting my shadow large and distorted against the damp earth walls of the hidden cellar. I sat on the cold ground, the roar of the waterfall a distant, primal heartbeat, and I read my mother's words. Her name was Sarah. In my memory, she was a soft, humming presence, a half-forgotten dream. On these pages, she was a woman of courage and conviction. Her journal told the story that Agnes's had only hinted at. My mother, trained as a nurse, had come to Havens Creek to help her aunt during an illness. She had started treating families downstream, children with persistent coughs, people with skin ailments, livestock that sickened and died without cause. She began to suspect the water. The Prescotts had recently opened a small, supposedly dormant silver mine high on their property, and my mother, with her scientific mind, made the connection. She believed they were using a chemical process that was leaching poison into the groundwater, poisoning the entire valley. The pure water from Agnes's falls was the only thing diluting the toxin, keeping a widespread disaster at bay. She began collecting evidence in secret. She took her own water samples, documented the illnesses, and matched them to the mine's operations, which she recorded in the ledgers I had found beside her journal. She had discovered the Prescott family's generational crime. They weren't just greedy land barons, they were killers, sacrificing the health of an entire community for the silver in their hills. The final entries were written in a hurried, frantic script. She had gathered enough proof. She was planning to take it all to the federal marshal in Denver. Agnes has offered to hide a copy of my findings, she wrote. She fears for me. Prescott watches me. His eyes are everywhere. But I cannot stand by and watch these people suffer. Daniel would have understood. She mentioned my father. And then, the last entry, dated the day before she died. I leave tomorrow. I have kissed my Eleanor goodbye. I told her I would be back in a week. May God keep her safe until I return. She never returned. The carriage crash I had been told was a tragic accident was no accident at all. They had killed her to silence her. They had killed her and left me an orphan, believing her secrets had died with her. But they hadn't. They had been sleeping here, under the hearthstone, guarded by one brave woman for decades, waiting for the daughter of the other. A cold, clarifying rage burned through my grief. They had taken everything from me, my mother, my father, my past. They had condemned me to a life of believing I was abandoned, forgotten. I would not let them win. I would finish what my mother started. But how? I had the evidence, but I was one woman against a family with 40 years of power and influence. Then I remembered a line from Agnes's journal, written years ago. I trust the post, not the bank. A letter can be hidden. Gold cannot. She had a deep-seated distrust of institutions that could be bought. She wouldn't have left the fate of this evidence to a single, hidden location. There had to be a backup. I left the cellar, carefully replacing the stone. I had to get to Martha. The storm had lessened to a steady drizzle. With Rook at my heels, I ran down the muddy track toward the supply post, my mother's journal clutched to my chest. Martha was closing up, her face etched with worry in the fading light. Child, you're soaked to the bone. What is it? Agnes, I gasped, leaning against the door frame. Did she ever give you anything to keep for her? A package? A letter. Martha's sharp eyes searched my face. She nodded slowly. She did. 20 years ago. Gave me a sealed woolcloth package. She said if her kin ever came, a woman with her niece's eyes, I was to give it to them. If no one came, upon her death, I was to send it by special courier to a name and address in Denver. She disappeared into the back room and returned with a flat, heavy package, wrapped and sealed with wax. She said it was insurance. Said the Prescotts had long arms, but they weren't smart enough to look for something right under their noses. My fingers trembled as I took it. The backup copy. Agnes and my mother had planned for this. They had trusted that one day, I would come. They had trusted that I would be strong enough. The community of Havens Creek was small, a handful of families bound together by the river that gave them life and, as we now knew, a slow, insidious poison. With Martha at my side, her presence a rock of credibility, I called a meeting at the supply post. The blacksmith, the farmer whose wife had been sick for years, the doctor who had been unable to explain the strange ailments, they all came. I laid it all out on the counter, my mother's journal, Agnes's water ledgers, the damning reports from the chemist in Denver that were inside the oilcloth package. I told them the story of the last 40 years, a story of two women who had fought to protect them in secret. I watched their faces as the truth settled over them, skepticism giving way to a dawning horror, and then to a slow-burning anger. These were quiet, stoic people, not given to grand displays of emotion, but I saw the shift in their eyes. They had suspected the Prescotts for years, whispered about it amongst themselves, but they were farmers and craftsmen, not fighters. They had no power. But now, they had proof. My youngest has had a lung sickness since she was born, the blacksmith, a large, gentle man named George, said, his voice thick with emotion. The doctor said it was the damp air. My crops have failed in the lower field for 3 seasons straight, the farmer added, his face grim. The one closest to the river. The stories began to pour out, a litany of quiet suffering that, when woven together, created an undeniable tapestry of the Prescott's guilt. We were no longer a collection of individuals. We were a community united by a shared wound. While the doctor wrote a wire to the federal marshal in Denver, summarizing our evidence and demanding his immediate presence, the men of the valley, led by George, made a quiet pact. They would stand guard at the turnoff to my cabin. No one would get to me. Thomas Prescott must have been alerted by Samuel that I knew the truth. He arrived the next morning, not on his fine horse, but in a buggy, flanked by 2 hard-faced men. He found his way blocked by a silent wall of farmers and craftsmen standing in the middle of the road. George stepped forward. "This is private land, Mr. Prescott," he said, his voice calm and steady. Prescott's polished veneer cracked. "I have business with Mrs. Reed." "Step aside." "Her business is our business now," George replied. I watched from the porch of the supply post as Prescott's face contorted with fury. The mask was gone completely, revealing the raw entitlement beneath. He was a man who had never been told no, whose family had bought and bullied their way through the world for generations. He looked from face to face, seeing not the timid tenants he had always known, but a unified front. He opened his mouth to shout, but at that moment, 3 riders appeared on the horizon, moving at a gallop. The federal marshal was a tall, weathered man with tired but determined eyes. He rode into our small assembly, his gaze taking in the scene with a practiced efficiency. He dismounted, and I stepped forward, handing him the oilcloth package. He broke the seal and spent several long minutes reading the documents, his expression growing grimmer with each page. He looked from the papers to Thomas Prescott, who stood frozen by his buggy. "Thomas Prescott," the marshal said, his voice carrying in the quiet morning air. "I have a warrant for your arrest, and for the seizure of your family's property, pending a federal investigation into the poisoning of the Haven Creek watershed." As the deputies moved forward, Prescott finally broke his silence, a strangled cry of disbelief and rage. It was the sound of a dynasty crumbling to dust. He was not just one man being arrested, he was the endpoint of a generational crime, finally brought to justice by the truth my mother had died to protect. I felt no triumph, only a deep, quiet sense of peace. The debt had been paid. The ledger was finally balanced. The months that followed were a time of profound change, for the valley and for me. The Prescott mine was shut down, its dark entrance sealed by federal order. Geologists and engineers arrived from the east, their talk filled with words like remediation and abatement. The process of healing the land would be slow, spanning years, but it had begun. I did not leave. The thought never even occurred to me. The cabin by the waterfall was no longer an inheritance, it was my home, my post. I had become the guardian Agnes had intended me to be. I worked alongside my neighbors, clearing tainted riverbanks and planting saplings of willow and birch, their roots meant to hold the soil and filter the water. My hands grew rougher, my body stronger. The woman who had lived by the precise scratch of a pen on paper learned the rhythms of the earth, the language of the seasons. The quiet returned, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was not the silence of isolation, but the peace of belonging. My found family was unassuming but ever present. Martha would save the best cuts of bacon for me. George's wife would send over fresh-baked bread. The doctor would stop by just to share a cup of coffee and talk about the new books he'd ordered. We were bound by more than proximity now, we were bound by a shared history and a collective hope for the future. Rook, my steadfast companion, grew old in the sun on the cabin porch, his presence a warm, familiar comfort. One evening, I took out a new, blank ledger. I sat at the old wooden table, the lamplight soft, the roar of the falls a constant lullaby. I opened it to the first page. On the shelf beside the hearth, my mother's journal and Agnes's journal sat side by side. I wrote my name on the first line, Delano Reed. Then I began to write, not of numbers and debts, but of the life blooming in the valley. I wrote of the first clear water test, of the return of the trout to the upper creek, of the day we held a picnic in the clearing with the great oak tree where my mother and Agnes used to meet in secret. I was no longer just the keeper of their story, I was writing the next chapter. 2 years after the arrest of Thomas Prescott, a small orphan girl named Lily arrived in Havens Creek. Her family had been farmers on a downstream tributary, wiped out by illness and debt long before the truth had come out. She was quiet and watchful, with the same old eyes I recognized in myself. She had been forgotten by the world. The town council wasn't sure what to do with her. I knew. I walked to the supply post where she was staying, knelt down so I was at her eye level, and held out my hand. "My name is Eleanor," I said. "I have a dog named Rook, and we live in a cabin by a big waterfall. There's a room there for you, if you'd like." She looked at my hand, then up at my face. She said nothing, but she slipped her small, trembling hand into mine. We walked home together, Rook trotting between us. As we reached the clearing, the late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, illuminating the mist from the falls in a rainbow of color. Lily stopped, her eyes wide with wonder. I looked at her, then at the sturdy cabin, at the powerful, life-giving water, at the land that was slowly, surely healing. The named grief of my life had been the fear that I belonged nowhere. But standing here, with a child's hand in mine, I knew I had been wrong. I had not been forgotten. I had simply been waiting to be found. This was my place. This was my purpose. This was home.